kind of a model. Next. And with that, I'll just share the few key implications for international nonprofits, right? So this is almost like a summary checklist that INGOs can take home. It's easier said than done. It's easier to put it down on paper, but harder to implement. The first is that they need to build the right frameworks for their localization strategies. So what are our success parameters? How do we define localization? When do we say that we've successfully had a local presence being created? Second is the question on governance models. So what kind of an ownership structure should exist? How do we form effective and inclusive boards? Thirdly, of course, the legal lay of the land, the written and the unwritten rule of law is crucial, which is why a lot of legal counsel is required, which is often a time-consuming process. Most importantly, forging local partnerships is key, because the on-ground local partners really have the right presence. They help build credibility. There's a lot of trust that's built through local community leaders as well. So effectively forging those local partnerships can help improve the presence that the INGO has at the country level. And, at the heart of any transition, decentralization of aid is a process. It's a big project that needs a lot of work. But at the heart of that process, we need to have a lot of buy-in from people, both at the INGO level, at the country level, within local civil society organizations as well. So there's a need to really empower and train local communities, and at the same time, get international organizations and their staff to realize the importance and the need for a transition. So with that, I will pause, and I'm very happy to invite Hemant Rathi, who's the Executive Director for Consulting and Research, who I work closely with, to share some of Sanam S4's work in the nonprofit space.
Yeah. Thank you, Shruti, and it's a pleasure to be here and part of this group. Shruti has touched upon various regarding decentralization and then what kind of challenges are being faced. So where does Sanam S4 come in? So we basically come in different areas, right from strategy to actual practical execution and implementation of the strategy on the ground. So we kind of start supporting the nonprofits with insight and intelligence, which would include things like regulatory assessment, market mapping, what's happening, what are the competitors doing in that market, kind of benchmarking vis-a-vis what other INGOs are doing, what's a priority focus area for that market, things like those, like the entire research about the market before we actually get into it. The second part is thinking about on the structuring side, that how do we structure the things with a nonprofit. Could be a single country, it could be multi-country structures. What is going to be the funding strategy? What it could be the transaction structure. So the entire financial consulting side of things, doing due diligence, financial modeling, and things like that. And then moving on to execute and support. Execute and support, I think there are a lot of nitty-gritties involved when it comes to local markets, which could involve things like entity formation, what are the legalities involved, what are the human capital requirements, the HR advisory side of things, partner assessment. So everything we do on the ground and partner with this NGO on that front. Then the last part where we support, or the next part we support, is in the ongoing governance and control. So it's not just about just setting up the entity and doing away with it. It's also about keeping a tab on the ongoing regulations and the compliance monitoring of the things. What is the impact evaluation? So things like, if the funds are flowing, are they being used in the right way and the right direction, that the way they are intended to, the entire legal support kind of thing. So that's where Sanam S4 comes in terms of right from understanding the market to the local execution and the governance and control side of things. Thanks. Over to Michael.
Thank you, Hemant, and welcome everybody, and thank you, Shruti, for that presentation. I'm very pleased to be kind of introducing Kim here, and it's really Kim and her team at Humentum that have gotten me smart on this topic and me smart on this trend just through their conferences and interventions last year. Of course, Humentum has an annual conference every year, and that's kind of gone for a toss, but they moved it all to virtual last year. So they had OpEx 365. And as part of that, they did a round of retreats for their members and invited industry partners like Sodom S4 in to participate as well. And, this topic was, just kept bubbling up throughout, kind of throughout the year. So we're really happy to have Kim, who's the director for membership from Humentum, with us, and to share her kind of reflections and perspectives on the topic. I will just make one kind of note. Again, the Q&A tab at the bottom, if anybody does have any questions, please just drop them there. After Kim's remarks, we'll be getting into a bit of a discussion. So with that, I think if we could pull this presentation down for the moment so Kim can share her screen.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's really lovely to be here. I think, Shiti, you did a great job of describing the history of decentralization. I think what I can speak to best is the current context of where we find ourselves right now with decentralization and where it's all taking place. I think it's the connections between the changes to business models and the large paradigm shifts, those big trends that are taking place in our sector right now that Humentum has been really thinking about quite a bit lately. Humentum's mission is to work with global development community to be equitable, accountable, and resilient. And a lot of those themes you touched on today already, right? How do organizations think about how we can be equitable in the long term across all of the work that we do, transparent and accountable and compliant, and then sustainable and resilient during all of this time of change. And it's become really clear as we've talked with all of our different member organizations, many of whom are INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, that all of those things are going to be key components of how we move forward. So right now we are seeing that things are being disrupted at a scale that we've never seen before. It truly is a paradigm shift, and organizations are at various stages of this change. What we're seeing right now is kind of three different categories of organizations right now. There are some that are still relatively new to this thinking, they're thinking we've seen change before, we've weathered change before, this will go back to normal. We don't need to make major changes. That's kind of one group of folks. There's a middle group of organizations who are saying, gosh, we know that change is here, but we're so focused on just keeping going, keeping payroll going, making sure that our projects are run on time, that we're so overwhelmed, we don't even know where to start. And then there are some organizations that are at the vanguard, that are at the front saying, we're going to lean into this change and start making some really deliberate, intentional choices. And so we're kind of at Humentum listening to all of those three groups of organizations and trying to come up with a story of what's happening right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can just give a little bit of background to this conversation around decentralization. All of the things that Michael said, we've been listening to our partners, like Sodom S4, we've been talking to our members and we've been talking to our clients and listening about what's been going on for the last year and a half in particular. And so this is what we're saying, what the world of work might look like going forward. And notice how this image doesn't say we're rethinking our world of work. We're not rethinking it anymore. We're actively reassembling, and reassembling is an active word that requires a deliberate process. And that is what is required right now. And that is what we're starting to see happen. So what we saw starting when the pandemic started, frankly, is this three-phase process. In the beginning, there was a little bit of panic, a little bit of anxiety, and then this rush of adrenaline to what do we do? People were moving from in-office work to remote work. The way that we worked changed rapidly, and there was this rush of adrenaline. Starting around last summer, that started to kind of slow down into burnout, into exhaustion, into decreased productivity. And then right now we're in a place where we're starting to look up and say, this is our new normal. I know we've all heard that term before. What does this mean? How are we going to bounce forward into something that's different, because this isn't really going anywhere. And so now we're in the redesign and reassemble phase. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a linear process. You have every right to go back and be tired and burnt out if every once in a while, but we're still going to keep going back to that phase 3 where we're looking at redesigning and reassembling. And the natural question that comes up when you're in that space is, okay, now what? What do we actually do about it? So we know that the change that we've been thinking about for many years, maybe 5-10 years, we've been saying change is coming, change is coming. We know that now change is here. It's no longer on the horizon. We are on the precipice of change. And we also know that change isn't new. It happens all the time. This image is of a life cycle of a standard normal change, even in stable times. Even in stable times, this is what change looks like, where you start in that gestation period, where there's a new idea, and then you kind of birth that new idea and you grow it until it becomes stable and mature. And at some point, like all things, it has to die. It goes into creative destruction. It gets composted into the energy for the next idea. And we know that right now we're in that phase. You can see under creative destruction on this image, things like travel, how we work in the office, the traditional role of headquarters, that's all ready for composting, for creative destruction into something new. And the ideas that are new that are coming up are things like global governance, decentralizing authority. And we're seeing that now with a lot of Humentum's members. We're starting to see those things like governance structures and decentralizing authority starting to happen. For example, we have a few organizations who are dissolving in and of themselves. They're saying we are going to move all of our funding and all of our projects to local national NGOs because it's the right thing to do. We're seeing more and more mergers and acquisitions within the playing field within the sector. And we're also seeing more and more executive teams starting to shift to a globally distributed model where they're recruiting leaders from all over the world instead of just at headquarters. So their executive teams may be located wherever it makes the most sense from the recruitment perspective, not necessarily all in one place. So these are just some examples of how this is happening and showing up in real life. So this for me is where we are right now. This is it. This is the context of this discussion about decentralization, where it sits within. Whereas before change, we might have said change is happening in one of these areas. So maybe 5 years ago, we would have said changes to funding are on the horizon. Right now, we're saying that we are being asked to adapt, if not transform, in all of these areas, which is probably why we're all so tired. This image represents all of the big trends, which is both challenges and opportunities that we're currently facing within the sector. Now, I could talk about each one of these bubbles all day, but really the question becomes, how do we connect the big ideas that we're talking about with the everyday operations, the decisions that we're making on the ground? And I think today's talk about decentralization models is a really good example of that. How do you take the big ideas, organizations who want to think about how can we be more equitable, more accountable, more sustainable, more resilient in these changing times? One really tangible way is to think about, well, is our business model continuing to serve us? Are there structural changes that we might need to make right now that will help to shift us in the right direction? And then the question becomes, how do you do that? Which hopefully is where we'll get to in some of the Q&A right now. Going forward. So this is a little bit of background, the context within which this conversation around locally led development and decentralization sits within. And I think just by being here and listening to the conversation, you're probably starting to be in that mindset right now.
Kim, thank you so much for those remarks and for Humentum's partnership and leadership on within the kind of INGO community. I think we'll open it up to Q&A. We do have some kind of discussion, and I'll turn it over to back to Ed Dixon for that.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your insights, which we'll be tapping into further. As Michael said, just a reminder, if there's any final questions, we have had a few through, please use the Q&A button such that I can direct them to the panel. So I think let's start. Hemant, if you're okay to take the